My name is Lucas, and my life has been a tapestry woven with faith, devotion, and unwavering purpose. For nearly 3 decades, the priesthood has been my refuge, a calling I embraced not with reluctance, but with ardor. It began when I was a boy, drawn inexplicably to the tranquility of the seminary, to the whispers of Scripture, and to the possibility that life could mean more than the mundane chaos of the everyday. Faith offered clarity, the church offered belonging. As I walked the polished stone floors of the seminary for the first time, I knew this was my path. I had no hesitation, no second guessing, and I rarely looked back. The structure appealed to me, the routines, the rituals, the steadfast predictability. It was as if I had stepped into the rhythm of something eternal, something that could not be disrupted. Faith became my compass, and the church my shelter. Years passed, and with them came the milestones of the priesthood, ordination, my first Mass, the laying on of hands as I took my vows before God. At the time, I was filled with wonder and hope. I would lead a congregation, I thought, and guide them toward the grace that had so transformed my own life. My parish was small, a modest stone church on the edge of town surrounded by centuries-old oaks and fields of wildflowers. But it was my family, and I poured every ounce of myself into serving them. From early morning prayers to late-night confessions, my days were devoted to the needs of my parishioners. There was comfort in the predictability of my routines, the rustle of robes as I prepared the altar, the incense that curled lazily toward the vaulted ceilings, and the warmth of sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. The church was alive, a sanctuary of hope and belonging for all who crossed its threshold. Yet, despite the peace this life afforded me, small cracks began to form in the certainty I once held so tightly. They were subtle at first, creeping in like whispers carried by the wind. It was not my faith in God that wavered, no, that remained steadfast. Rather, it was the institution itself that began to trouble me. The debates among my fellow priests over matters of church policy often felt self-serving, prioritizing rules over compassion. Decisions by church leaders, meant to uphold tradition, sometimes seemed to overshadow the needs of the people we served. One day, during a meeting with the bishop, I raised the importance of expanding our food pantry, a program designed to support struggling families in our parish. The idea filled me with passion and conviction, yet the bishop's response was tepid. "The sacraments must remain our focus," he said. "Programs like this, while admirable, can distract from the spiritual needs of the church." His words left a bitter taste in my mouth. Surely feeding the hungry and clothing the poor were acts of faith as sacred as any sacrament? How had we come to view these acts of service as distractions? And so, the unease lingered. It grew heavier with each passing year, filling the quiet spaces between my prayers. There were moments when I felt disconnected from the people I was meant to serve. Times when the church seemed more concerned with preserving its image than fulfilling its mission. I remember officiating a wedding for a prominent family, knowing the groom openly disregarded the church's teachings. "It's good for the church's reputation," I was told. I nodded dutifully, but the pit in my stomach remained. Then there was the day I was forced to turn away a single mother seeking baptism for her child. The criteria were clear, my colleagues said, and her circumstances did not meet them. Rules are rules, I was told when I voiced my concern. But those rules, which had once given me comfort, now felt like walls that separated us from the people we were supposed to serve. I began spending longer hours in the confessional, not because of the parishioners who came to me, but because of the silence it offered. There, in the solitude of the small dark booth, I whispered my doubts to God. "Am I serving you, Lord? Is this truly your will?" I told myself these doubts were a test of faith, a phase that would pass if only I prayed harder and surrendered fully to God's plan. But no matter how fervently I prayed, the doubts did not fade. Instead, they grew, whispering truths I was not ready to confront. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind I had experienced countless times before. The pews were filled with familiar faces, bathed in the soft light of the stained glass windows. I was midway through the Eucharistic prayer, my hands raised in blessing, when a sudden pain shot through my chest. At first I thought it was nothing, a fleeting discomfort, but it quickly escalated. The pain radiated down my arm and up to my jaw. My vision blurred, and the sacred words I had recited so many times before became impossible to speak. The chalice slipped from my hands, and I stumbled backward, clutching the altar for support. Panic filled the room as parishioners rushed forward, their faces swimming before me in a haze of confusion. I tried to reassure them, to tell them I was fine, but no sound came out. The world around me dimmed, and then darkness. Faith had always been my anchor, a guiding light in a world often obscured by shadows. As a priest, I believed I was fulfilling a divine mission, offering clarity, solace, and purpose to those who sought it. My days were steeped in service and tradition, each one a thread in the fabric of a life dedicated to God. Yet, as the years went by, cracks began to form in the certainty I held so tightly, creeping in like shadows around the edges of a beam of light. It wasn't that I doubted God. That was unthinkable. My faith in Him remained steadfast, like a rock unmoved by the shifting tides. But doubts of a different kind began to stir within me, doubts about the institution I had devoted my life to. These were not loud, clamorous doubts, they whispered in the quiet corners of my mind, arriving uninvited but impossible to ignore. At first they were fleeting moments, questions too delicate to linger on for long. I would overhear heated debates between my fellow priests, their voices hushed yet tense, discussing matters of politics within the diocese. As the discussions turned toward decisions favoring tradition over compassion, I felt unease rise within me. Was this what our faith demanded of us? Did the needs of the people we were called to serve hold less weight than the preservation of institutional stability? The feeling grew stronger during meetings with church leaders where compassion was often overshadowed by pragmatism. One such meeting involved the future of our food pantry, a program I cherish deeply, as it fed countless families on the brink of despair. I raised the issue with passion, convinced that expanding the pantry was not just a practical necessity, but a spiritual mandate. Christ Himself had called us to feed the hungry, hadn't He? The bishop's response, however, chilled me. The sacraments must remain our focus, he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Programs like these, while noble, should not overshadow the spiritual needs of the Church. I nodded in agreement, outwardly obedient, but inside his words unsettled me. Was not feeding the hungry an act of spiritual significance? Wasn't love and service the very heart of Christ's message? This was not the only moment that added weight to the doubts clouding my mind. Over the years, I had witnessed decisions that seemed incongruous with the teachings of Christ. Weddings performed for prominent families despite glaring moral contradictions. Baptisms denied to struggling single mothers for not meeting arbitrary criteria. Each time I was told it was necessary for the Church's image or adherence to tradition, but these explanations felt hollow. I began to spend more time in solitude, finding refuge in the small confessional booth where, ironically, I rarely received confessions anymore. It became a quiet haven, a place where I could whisper my own doubts to God without fear of judgment. "Am I serving you as you wish, Lord?" I would ask, my voice trembling in the darkness. "Are the rules we follow truly your will?" The answers never came, or perhaps I was too afraid to listen. I carried on, not speaking of my doubts to anyone, not to my fellow priests, not to my parishioners, and certainly not to the bishop. I convinced myself that these moments of unease were simply tests of faith, challenges to be overcome through prayer and dedication. And yet, despite my fervent prayers, the doubts did not fade. They lingered, growing heavier with each passing year. Then came the moments that deepened my introspection. Families in our parish faced crises, yet the Church's policies hindered immediate help. A single mother approached me, desperate to baptize her child, but institutional rules were a wall that blocked her path. My heart longed to grant her request, but obedience held me back. As tears welled in her eyes, a pang of guilt echoed in mine. What kind of servant was I, caught between compassion and rigidity? There were nights when I stared at the wooden beams of my bedroom ceiling, praying for clarity. "Show me the way, Lord," I whispered, again and again. But the silence stretched long, endless. I wrestled with whether the rules I'd followed so faithfully reflected the true essence of God's love. The turning point came one ordinary Sunday morning, a day that began like any other. I stood at the altar, my hands raised in blessing, reciting the Eucharistic prayer with the familiarity of thousands of repetitions. The The church was full of familiar faces, each bathed in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. It should have been a moment of peace, of purpose. But as the chalice slipped from my hands and I fell to the ground, clutching my chest in agony, I knew my life was about to change forever. For 30 years, Sunday mornings had been my sanctuary. The rhythms of the liturgy, the solemnity of the prayers, and the warmth of the congregation gave me purpose. But that particular Sunday shattered the routine I had clung to for decades. It began like any other, yet it would soon descend into a darkness that would forever alter the course of my life. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctuary in hues of ruby and gold. The pews were filled with familiar faces, each one a living testament to the community I had devoted my life to serving. I smiled at them as I ascended the altar, preparing myself for the Eucharistic prayer. The chalice, cradled in my hands, was a symbol of responsibility I had borne for countless services. Its weight was both familiar and comforting. I began the prayer with a steady voice, reciting words that had guided generations before me. The congregation bowed in reverence, and in that moment there was a profound connection between us and the divine. At least, that's how it had always felt. But suddenly, a sharp pain burst into my chest. At first I assumed it was nothing, a fleeting discomfort perhaps from too many hours on my feet. I attempted to ignore it, focusing instead on the sacred words. Yet the pain intensified, radiating down my left arm and across my jaw. My vision blurred, and the chalice suddenly became unbearably heavy. Panic seeped into my thoughts as I gripped the altar for support, my prayer faltering. I caught glimpses of worry in the eyes of my parishioners, but their concern sounded distant, as if I were watching everything from beyond a veil. A wave of dizziness overcame me, and before I could utter even a small prayer, the chalice slipped from my grasp and shattered on the stone floor, sending droplets of wine scattering like tiny rubies. I staggered and fell, clutching my chest while the room spun around me. Voices cried out my name, but amidst the chaos I felt detached, an observer of my own disintegration. I collapsed onto the cold floor, the faces of my congregation blurred into a mix of confusion and fear. Someone knelt beside me, their frantic prayers rising up in whispers that I could no longer comprehend. And then I found myself swallowed by darkness. In that enveloping void I became weightless. There was no pain, no panic, only a profound stillness that was as strange as it was calm. I soon discovered I was no longer tethered solely to my body. Instead, my very essence, or soul, seemed to float free in an expanse defined by a radiant light. This light was warm and all-encompassing, wrapping around me like an ancient embrace. It was not the harsh brilliance of the sun, but an intimate, pulsing glow, full of serenity and love. In this luminous realm, I began to observe things with a clarity that defied my earthly senses. I saw an image of myself lying on the church floor, surrounded by a sea of concerned faces. The details were vivid, the glint of sunlight on the shattered chalice, the folds of my vestments pooling on the cold tile, and the desperate expressions of those who tried to save me. Though I longed to reassure them, I found I had no voice, no physical form to carry my thoughts back to the world I was now leaving behind. Yet amidst the light, something unexpected emerged, a subtle but distinct shadow at the periphery of this radiant space. At first it was barely more than a flicker, but steadily the shadow gained form and presence. Unlike any darkness cast by light, this shadow appeared deliberate, a void holding its own weight of mystery and quiet authority. I felt an instinctive pull toward it, a mix of apprehension and curiosity that I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. I drifted closer to this shadow, and as I did, the harmonious glow of the light began to fade, replaced by a cool, profound silence. It was as if the shadow was a reflection of all the unspoken questions that had haunted me for years, the doubts about duty, the tension between rigid rules and boundless compassion. And yet, even as the silence grew overwhelming, I felt no terror. Instead, there was an unmistakable invitation, a call to confront the hidden truths of my life. In that suspended, weightless moment, I realized that this was not simply an experience of dying. It was a journey, a passage into an uncharted realm where every choice, every sacrifice, and every whispered prayer was laid bare. The radiant light had not altogether abandoned me. It pulsed within like a steady echo of hope, a promise that even amid darkness, a part of me remained whole. I sensed that the truth of my existence was not confined to the life I had known, nor could it be measured by the strict boundaries of earthly institutions. Then, as if carried along by an unseen current, I let go of all that I had been attached to, my doubts, my fears, and the rigid expectations that had governed my years of service. I surrendered completely to the mysterious presence that enveloped me, ready to accept whatever revelations lay ahead. It was a surrender not of defeat but of trust, a trust that the luminous presence and the encroaching shadow were guiding me toward a higher understanding of love, sacrifice, and eternal truth. For what felt like an eternity and yet no time at all, I floated between light and dark, between certainty and unfathomable mystery. In that transcendent space, I understood that the collapse of my physical form was, paradoxically, the beginning of a journey toward inner freedom. As I felt myself drifting onward, I sensed that my life as I knew it was evolving into something far more profound, an exploration of the heart of faith beyond ritual and doctrine. And so, in that sacred moment of collapse, I welcomed the unknown, prepared to embrace a truth that had always been waiting just beyond the confines of certainty. I awoke into a world far removed from the familiar stone walls of the church. In this new realm, I was engulfed by a luminous radiance that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of its own. The light was soft yet all-encompassing, its warmth permeating every fiber of my being. It was not harsh like the midday sun, but rather it offered a gentle affection, as if the universe itself was cradling me in a tender embrace. As I drifted in this extraordinary space, I began to notice that the light was not simply a backdrop to my experience. It was active, dynamic, and filled with subtle variations. Hues of gold, amber, and soft white ebbed and flowed in a mesmerizing dance, creating patterns that moved in synchrony with what I now understood to be the pulse of existence itself. I felt an intense curiosity mix with an overwhelming peace as I absorbed these sensations, realizing that I had stepped into a realm where every moment was saturated with meaning beyond words. In this realm of radiant light, time seemed suspended. There was no rush, no evident beginning or end, only a constant state of presence. Here, the usual pressures of life melted away, replaced by a sensation of limitless possibility. I soon discovered that the light was more than a mere environmental feature. It was a reflection of a deeper, ineffable truth about existence. I could sense that within its glowing embrace lay the answers to questions that had long haunted my spirit. Questions about purpose, love, and the nature of faith. I allowed myself to float deeper into this luminous space, each movement imbued with a gentle grace that I had never experienced in my earthly existence. As I drifted further, I found that the light spoke to me in a language beyond words, a symphony of sensations that communicated emotions, memories, and profound realizations. At moments, fragments of my past life, faces from the congregation, quiet nights of prayer and solitude, even moments of unspoken doubt, flashed before me, suffused with an aura of understanding that transcended judgment or regret. Every now and then, the radiance would grow even brighter, and in those moments, I felt as though I was being bathed in a truth that was at once both timeless and forever new. It was in these bursts of overwhelming brightness that I sensed the presence of something vast and benevolent, a force that had always resided in the depths of my soul. I understood then that this light was the eternal essence of love and compassion, a manifestation of divine truth that was accessible to every heart willing to be open. In the quiet serenity of this realm, I began to ask questions, soft, tentative inquiries that stirred within me like ripples on a still pond. What is the purpose of all that I have known, I wondered. How do the rituals and rules of my earthly life connect to this endless light? The answers did not come through spoken words. Rather, they emerged as feelings, as a deep, resonant knowing that seemed to flow directly into my consciousness. The light reassured me that faith was never meant to be a collection of rigid procedures or hollow dogma, but a living, ever-evolving bond between the divine and the human heart. Drifting steadily through this luminous expanse, I encountered subtle shifts in the glow, moments when the light seemed to pulse with life in response to my very thoughts and emotions. I felt a profound joy mingled with an inexplicable sorrow, as if every lost possibility and every broken promise in my past were being gently reconciled in the glow of this sanctified space. It was as though the radiant light had the power to heal wounds that I had long carried, to transform sorrow into understanding and regret into forgiveness. I marveled at the realization that this realm was not a place of judgment, but one of immense compassion. I was no longer burdened by the strict confines of earthly expectations, and every judgment or harsh word from the past melted away in the brilliance surrounding me. Instead, I felt an irresistible invitation to embrace the fullness of my humanity, to understand that love, in its truest form, was far more expansive than any institutionalization of faith could ever capture. In that openness, I allowed myself to surrender completely. I recognized that the radiant light was not calling me to abandon my identity as a servant of God, but rather to deepen it. It urged me to see that the heart of faith was not in the rigid observance of rituals, but in the compassionate, living connection between souls. Every spark of brilliance in that realm whispered secrets of a love that was forgiving, transformative, and ever-present in every moment. As I floated there, lost in the symphony of light and emotion, I absorbed the truth that I had been seeking all my life. The radiant light was a reflection of the divine, all the love, grace, and mercy that had been promised from the beginning. It was a reminder that beyond the confines of earthly institutions lay an unfathomable mystery, one defined not by limitations and rules, but by an enduring, boundless embrace. In these sacred moments, as I surrendered to the glow of that transcendent realm, I felt an overwhelming inheritance of tranquility and hope. The light had become both my companion and my guide, and with it, I sensed the beginnings of a new understanding, an understanding that would redefine every notion of worship, every word of doctrine I had ever known. It was a luminous promise that in embracing the radiant light, I would be free to rewrite the boundaries of my faith and reawaken to a truth that is as eternal as the light itself. In the days following my encounter with the radiant light, I found myself wandering through a realm of transcendence that, while suffused with divine warmth, began to reveal an undercurrent of contrast, a subtle, persistent shadow. At first, it appeared only as a faint ripple at the edges of my vision, an echo of darkness hovering in the periphery of the glowing expanse. Yet over time, that shadow grew in presence and clarity, and I felt it calling to me with a quiet insistence that I could no longer ignore. I recall the moment vividly. I was drifting in a calm sea of light, absorbing its gentle vibrancy and the profound peace it offered, when a cool, almost imperceptible chill crept along the border of my awareness. At first, I mistook it for a momentary lapse in the glow, an interruption in the symphony of colors that filled my new existence. But as seconds stretched into an eternity, the chill deepened into a dense, deliberate darkness. It was as if I were witnessing two worlds converging, the luminous truth that had enveloped my soul and the stark, unyielding void of shadows that represented all I had left unspoken in my past. The call of the shadow was not harsh or accusatory, yet it carried with it an undeniable weight, a silent summons to confront the darker corners of my soul. I sensed that this shadow was not simply an absence of light, but rather a repository of the doubts, the fears, and the unhealed wounds I had long since suppressed. In the radiant realm, every pain, every regret was seemingly reconciled by the endless brilliance, yet here in the encroaching darkness, those very imperfections stirred restlessly. Slowly, I edged toward it, compelled by a mixture of trepidation and longing. The light receded as I approached, yielding space to the expanding gloom that seemed to pulse with its own quiet rhythm. In that moment, the boundary between my conscious self and my deeper vulnerabilities dissolved. I felt as though I were no longer an isolated fragment of light, but a complete being tempered by both luminescence and shadow. As I moved closer, the darkness took on shape, a formless yet unmistakable presence that mirrored my inner conflicts. There was an intangible sensation of being drawn to it, like a moth to a quiet flame. I could almost hear its silent call, a whisper that resonated with the echoes of every regret, every doubt that had ever haunted me. It spoke of a past I had long tried to bury beneath devotion, of moments when fear had eclipsed truth. It beckoned me to face the parts of myself I had kept hidden behind walls of unwavering certainty. In that profound stillness, I allowed the shadow to envelop me. The act was not one of surrender to despair, but rather an invitation to understand. I realized that this darkness was as essential to my being as the light itself. It was the container of all the complexity of my soul, The questions I had never dared to voice, the guilt I had silently carried, the sorrow I had dismissed in favor of routine piety. With the radiant light nourishing my spirit and the shadow challenging it, I stood on the threshold of a greater, more nuanced truth. Images surged past me, reminiscent of fragmented memories, moments of pain during long nights of prayer, the silent anguish in the eyes of those I failed to save, and the quiet criticisms that had once stung in solitude. This darkness was raw and unfiltered, a repository of all those emotions I had polished away with the brightness of idealism. And in this communion with the shadow, I discovered that acknowledging my imperfections was not a rejection of light, but an essential step toward wholeness. The shadow did not judge. Instead, it mirrored what had been hidden even from my own heart. It called to me to look beyond the safe confines of the liturgical rituals, to question the inflexible doctrines that had so long defined my service. In its silent language, it urged me to embrace a truer form of compassion, one that recognized the beauty in both our light and our darkness. As I let myself be drawn deeper into the shadow's domain, I found that the boundaries between fear and hope, despair and liberation began to blur. I could sense a transformation occurring within, the gradual integration of that unacknowledged part of me into a more complete self. The darkness, once intimidating, softened into a kind of quiet understanding. It was as if the shadow was revealing that the very things I had tried so desperately to hide were, in fact, integral to who I was and who I might yet become. In that defining moment, the shadow's call merged with the memory of the radiant light, creating a tapestry of duality that resonated deeply within me. I recognized that, like day and night, my spirit could not exist solely in brightness. The interplay of light and dark was the essence of existence, a reminder that every choice, every emotion, carried within it the seeds of both creation and dissolution. I was called not to fear the darkness, but to let it refine my understanding of love, loss, and the fragile nature of faith. Emerging from that intimate encounter with the shadow, I felt transformed. I was no longer wholly defined by the luminous certainty that had once been my only reality. The shadow had imparted its quiet lessons, inviting me to embrace the full spectrum of my humanity. Its call was gentle but insistent, urging me to move forward with a soul that was more compassionate, more reflective, and infinitely more real. Thus, with every pulse of light and every whisper of darkness, I continued my journey, aware that both elements were necessary to shape the fullness of my true self. The shadow's call was not a dirge for lost certainty, but a promise of growth beyond it. I found myself drifting in the interstice between the realms of radiant light and lingering shadow, a space where time and form seemed to melt into one continuous, uncharted expanse. It was here, amid a gentle yet vibrant pulse of existence, that I sensed a presence drawing near with the quiet authority of a long-awaited revelation. At first, the presence appeared as a subtle ripple in the luminous field, a disturbance in the seamless glow that I had come to know so intimately. But gradually, as if summoned by a silent command, the ripple took shape. From within the effulgent brilliance emerged a figure unlike any I had ever encountered, a being whose form radiated both immense warmth and a calm, penetrating empathy. His appearance was fluid and transcendent, clothed in an aura of softly shimmering light that blurred the boundaries between human and divine. In his eyes, I saw not judgment, but a deep, compassionate understanding that reached into the innermost corridors of my soul. The being regarded me with a gaze that felt as if it could see through every layer of doubt and fear I had ever harbored. His voice, when it came, was not heard in the usual sense. Rather, it resonated directly within me, a harmonious blend of sound and emotion. "Lucas," it intoned gently, "you have journeyed far in search of truth, and in your heart the light has always been waiting to expand." I felt both humbled and empowered by his presence. Here, in this ethereal space, I was no longer bound by the strictures of earthly dogma or the confines of any institution. Instead, I stood at the threshold of an understanding that transcended conventional doctrine, a realization that the essence of faith was not about rigid adherence to tradition, but about the deep transformative power of love and compassion. In the quiet communion that followed, I found myself compelled to share the burden of my inner conflicts. I recounted to him the dissonance that had accompanied my years of service, the moments when the weight of institutional rules clashed with the raw need for empathy, the times when my own doubts simmered beneath the surface of dutiful prayer. The being listened intently, and in the silence that stretched between our exchanged thoughts, I felt an overwhelming sense of release. No longer was I alone with my uncertainties. In his presence, they were acknowledged as vital parts of my journey, fragments of a larger truth waiting to be integrated. Without resorting to lengthy explanations or drawn-out sermons, he began to unfold lessons that resonated directly within me. He spoke of faith as a living, breathing quality, not a stagnant mass of rituals, but an ever-changing celebration of interconnected souls. True worship, he conveyed in that silent, heartfelt language, is found in the way you embrace each moment, the way you see the divine spark in every human heart. Your doubts, your pain, and even your imperfections, they are not failures or sins to be hidden. They are the very crucible in which the purest form of love is forged. As his words echoed through the luminous space, images and memories began to flow before my inner eyes. I saw the faces of those I had ministered to, the quiet smiles of the faithful, the tearful relief of the suffering, and realized how deeply interconnected our lives truly were. I recalled the moments of fleeting compassion, and also the instances when my own shortcomings had left me feeling isolated. In that intermingling of images, the being's guidance became clear. Every crack in my certainty was an invitation to deepen my understanding of love, to let compassion and forgiveness bridge the gaps between tradition and genuine empathy. Curiosity and need drove me further into our dialogue. I hesitated, then asked, "How can I return to my people and share this truth? How do I reconcile the rigid boundaries of our traditions with this vast, living love you've shown me?" His response was both tender and transformative. He did not give me a list of instructions, rather he gently illuminated the path that lay ahead. "Begin with yourself," he seemed to say. "Embrace your whole being, the light, the shadow, every question. Let your actions speak the language of love. When you step back into your world, let every act of compassion be a testament to the boundless nature of your spirit. Remember, Lucas, that the greatest transformation starts from within." His presence began to merge with the luminous field, yet the intensity of his message and the echo of his words remained as tangible as the finest gold leaf. Even as the figure became less distinct, fading into the celestial dance of light and shadow, I knew that his guidance was now a permanent part of me. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a call to integrate the wisdom of our encounter into every facet of my life. In the aftermath of that profound meeting, I sensed a shift, a gentle unburdening of the weight that had long pressed upon my spirit. I realized that, within that divine encounter, lay the promise of a more compassionate, transformative path. I was no longer merely a keeper of rituals. I had become a vessel for a dynamic, ever-evolving love that transcended definitions and expectations. Every heartbeat, every silent prayer thereafter was now touched by the memory of that luminous guide, reminding me that the true essence of my calling was to be a beacon of unconditional love. Thus, as I began my journey back to the realm of the living, I carried with me an inner radiance that had been enriched by the encounter. It was an enduring flame, a promise that through sincere compassion and unwavering authenticity, I could reshape the boundaries of faith and offer my community a glimpse of the profound truth that once transformed my very soul. In the quiet aftermath of my transcendent encounter, I found that the luminous realm began to reveal deeper layers of my past. In that meditative space where time lost its meaning and emotions flowed like an endless tide, visions unfolded before me, a cascade of memories that both illuminated and challenged the very core of my being. At first, the images arrived as fleeting whispers, flashes of my early years, the hopeful, wide-eyed moments of a young man eager to serve, the gentle, compassionate touch offered to those in need, and the tender smiles exchanged during moments of quiet prayer. Yet, interwoven with these luminous echoes were scenes of rigidity and regret. I witnessed moments when I, blinded by strict adherence to tradition, had allowed compassion to be sacrificed at the altar of doctrine. One vision showed me standing at the door of my church as a desperate single mother pleaded for her child's baptism, her eyes heavy with both hope and despair. I saw in that moment the cost of my own obedience, a cost measured not merely in missed opportunities for grace, but in the silent anguish of a soul left uncherished. As the sequence of images deepened, I was drawn into a vivid tapestry where every act of devotion was counterbalanced by an equally potent moment of introspection. I saw myself ministering with fervor and care during times of crisis, offering solace in the form of kind words and gentle embraces. Yet, I also encountered the stark, unyielding moments when I recited prayers mechanically, my heart hardened by the weight of expectations and unyielding traditions. The interplay of these images painted a portrait of my life in its entirety, a mixture of luminous generosity and the shadows of self-imposed limitations. In one particularly moving vision, I stood before a congregation, soberingly aware of the contradictions within my actions. There, I saw the faces of those I had cared for, the elderly neighbor whose eyes lit up at my kind greeting, the grieving father who found temporary comfort in my words, the lost and wandering souls searching for an anchor in their despair. Yet, intertwined with these scenes were the faces of those who felt abandoned, whose pain had been dismissed by my adherence to strict protocols. The realization struck me with a sudden clarity. Every act of kindness, every gentle word, was inseparable from the times I had failed to question a rule, to extend mercy where it was desperately needed. The visions did not simply recount memories. They carried within them lessons of integration. I began to understand that the truth of my life was not to be found in the sterile perfection of unyielding devotion, but rather in the dynamic interplay of light and dark, the beautiful messiness of human existence. In one breathtaking sequence, I witnessed how my moments of doubt and regret had quietly set the stage for growth. The very cracks in my certainty had allowed beams of compassion to seep in, and it was through those imperfections that I learned the true meaning of empathy. As the scenes shifted, a powerful feeling of interconnectedness emerged. I observed how every decision, every moment of inner conflict, had contributed to the person I was becoming. The visions revealed that my life was a tapestry woven from both my successes and my failures, and that every thread, no matter how frayed, was essential to the whole. I saw the cumulative weight of my good deeds and my missteps, each one a note in the symphony of my spiritual journey. Rather than disparage my past, the visions urged me to embrace it fully, to see in every regret an invitation for change, and in every triumph the seeds of further growth. In the midst of these revelations, the voices of those I had once served began to speak, a chorus of silent testimonies that mingled with the images. I heard the gentle gratitude of the weary souls who had found moments of peace through my care, and the quiet sorrow of those who had suffered because I clung too tightly to convention. Their voices, soft yet insistent, interwove with the visions, creating a profound dialogue between my inner world and the lives I had touched. This intimate communion with my past awakened a resolute clarity in me. The path to redemption lay not in erasing my errors, but in acknowledging and integrating them. The visions urged me to break free from the illusion that perfection was the only commendable path. Instead, I learned that true compassion required embracing every facet of my humanity, the luminous and the shadowed alike. It was a call to accept that each mistake was a stepping stone toward greater understanding, each moment of doubt an opportunity to rediscover the true nature of faith. In that revelation, I experienced an inner transformation, a shift from seeing my past as a series of disjointed events to recognizing it as a continuous narrative of evolution. The journey through these visions filled me with a profound sense of purpose. I realized that if I was to return to my people, I must do so not as a rigid keeper of dogma, but as a shepherd, whose heart was open to both pain and joy, who recognized that healing and growth sprang from the honest acceptance of all of life's truths. As the visions gradually receded, leaving me enveloped in a reflective silence, I carried with me the unshakable conviction that truth is both complex and redemptive. It was not enough to celebrate the light, one must also confront and learn from the darkness. With that realization, I felt an inner light ignite, a radiant promise of further transformation, of the potential to rebuild my faith with a foundation that honored every truth I had seen. Thus, with every vision now ingrained in my soul, I emerged from that transcendent state ready to integrate these lessons into my life. I would endeavor to become a vessel of genuine compassion, one who embraced the totality of human experience as the true measure of love and faith. I slowly awoke to the soft murmur of familiar voices and the gentle warmth of ordinary light filtering through a window. When my eyes fluttered open, I found myself lying on a modest hospital bed, a far cry from the endless expanse of luminous realms I had just traversed. The world around me was tangible again, the steady beeping of monitors, the rustle of nurses' footsteps, and the quiet hum of everyday life. Returning to my body after that profound journey felt surreal, as if I were stepping between two different worlds. In the days that followed, I embarked on a period of recovery that was both physical and spiritual. My body, once so reliable, now felt tender and unfamiliar, while my mind bristled with the vivid impressions of what I had experienced. I sat by my window in moments of solitude, reflecting on the radiant light, the enveloping shadows, and the divine presence that had guided me during the collapse of my old certainties. There was no resentment or longing for the transcendence I'd witnessed. Rather, there was a gentle determination to integrate every lesson learned into the fabric of my earthly existence. Returning to my parish was not a simple matter of resuming routine duties. I found that the transformation was not confined to a distant, ethereal realm. It had taken root in my heart and mind. I began to notice simple miracles in everyday life, the kind smile of a stranger, the rustle of leaves in a quiet breeze. That reminded me of nature's quiet benediction, and even the soft gaze of long-forgotten friends carrying messages of hope. Each moment felt imbued with the memory of that transcendent journey. Even as I mended physically, I mended spiritually, understanding that every scar and every moment of pain had contributed to the depth of my newfound wisdom. When I returned to the church, I was met with a mixture of concern, joy, and curiosity. Parishioners who once saw me solely as an unwavering vessel of tradition now noticed something different in my eyes, the unmistakable glimmer of a soul who had truly beheld both light and darkness. I resumed my duties with an inner quietude that was both calming and reassuring. At Mass, as I led prayers and distributed blessings, I found that every word I spoke now resonated with the tender compassion of someone who had learned that the divine was as much found in vulnerability as in certainty. In conversations with members of my congregation, I listened more intently and questioned more gently. I began to offer counsel that was not confined by rigid doctrine, but was suffused with empathy and understanding. A young woman once confided in me about her struggles with faith and fear of not measuring up. Instead of resorting to rehearsed platitudes, I shared fragments of my own inner journey, how I had faced the amalgam of radiant truths and implacable shadows, and how that confrontation had taught me to embrace imperfection as part of the divine design. In doing so, I discovered that my transformation was not an isolated event. It rippled outward, touching lives and softening hardened hearts. But even with this gentle integration, the challenges of returning to everyday reality were real. The hospital and the quiet recovery room were symbols of the limitations of mortal life. I saw in them the contrast between the transcendent experiences I had known and the concrete struggles of the body. There were moments when evening shadows in familiar corridors would stir echoes of that deeper darkness from beyond. In those times, I reminded myself that the shadows I had encountered on my journey were not adversaries but vital teachers, messengers that even in our earthly existence, we must not fear our doubts, our regrets, and our tears. As weeks blurred into months, a subtle metamorphosis took place. I began to introduce small changes in the church's practices, a soft adjustment in liturgy, an openness to discussions about mindfulness and personal transformation, a more pronounced invitation for my parishioners to share their inner truths. While some clung to the old ways and others hesitated in the face of such candid vulnerability, I persisted gently. I realized that to instigate true change, I had to model the integration of light and shadow in my own life. The divine, I came to understand, was not a distant, unchanging standard, but a living, breathing reality that admitted imperfection and transformation. There were still long nights when I sat alone in quiet prayer, contemplating the interplay of my latest memories with those of my transcendent visions. I scribbled down thoughts in long-forgotten journals, piecing together insights from the radiant light, the shadow's call, and the visions of my truth. In those solitary hours, I recognized that my journey was far from over. It had merely advanced to a new stage, I was no longer just a priest delivering sacraments. I was a messenger bridging the gap between established tradition and an ever-unfolding, compassionate living truth. In confronting the familiar faces of those I had once guided, I felt a renewed responsibility to share not only the comfort of certainty, but also the healing power that comes from confronting our inner darkness. I believe that by admitting our faults and embracing our struggles, we could create a more authentic community, a space where both faith and doubt were welcomed as inextricable parts of the human soul. My homecoming was a celebration of this integration, a return not to the old self, but to an enriched existence where every moment, no matter how ephemeral, resonated with the promise of transformation. Thus, as I settled back into a life marked by both routine and revival, I carried with me the radiant light of my visions and the quiet strength of the shadows. I was determined to lead not merely with solemnity but with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the full spectrum of human experience, a testament to the hope that even in the depths of despair, true transformation and healing await. I now stand at the threshold of a renewed existence, a place where the old confines of unquestioned tradition yield to a dynamic embrace of both light and shadow, a covenant of faith reborn. The revelations of my journey have not left me unchanged. Rather, they have woven into my soul a tapestry of transformative insights. In this new covenant, I have come to understand that true faith is not sealed by rituals alone, but is continuously renewed by the honest interplay of human vulnerability and divine compassion. Walking once more through the familiar corridors of the church, I notice how every step echoes with new meaning. The cool stone beneath my feet and the soft murmur of prayers now serve not as relics of a static past, but as invitations to a deeper, more fluid expression of our shared humanity. I have learned that the divine is not found solely in the perfection of dogma, but also in the imperfections that mark our journey. Each doubt, each sorrow, even every unspoken question becomes a passageway toward a more profound connection with the grace that surrounds us. When I resumed my ministry upon returning home, I discovered that those who once knew me as a mere servant of tradition now sensed a spark of something different in my eyes, an openness to the messy, beautiful truth of our existence. Parishioners approached me not only for comfort, but to share their own struggles and uncertainties. In quiet conversations after Mass or in the gentle solace of the church garden, I witnessed a growing desire among the people for a faith that recognized their pain as well as their hope. One evening, a young mother tearfully confided her daily battle against despair and isolation. Her words unveiled her longing for a form of worship built not on fear of judgment, but on the promise of unconditional love. Her plea resonated with the lessons of my mystical journey, the revelation that our shared vulnerabilities can become the soil in which genuine compassion takes root. In response, I began to reshape the boundaries of our community's spiritual practice. Rituals that once reinforced rigid hierarchies were infused with a new spirit, one that encouraged open dialogue, quiet introspection, and a celebration of the creative impulses that connect us all to something larger than ourselves. I invited musicians, poets, and artists to join our services, transforming the church into a living canvas where the sacred was not only spoken but also felt in vibrant expressions of art and song. These gatherings became a sanctuary where doubts were acknowledged and every question was honored as a step toward deeper understanding. Conversations among the clergy reflected this emerging openness as well. Once bound by a tradition of Stoic conformity, we began to meet in small, informal circles where we could share our struggles, those moments when our own human frailties had conflicted with the impersonal edicts of our order. In these sacred dialogues, our collective pain and longing found voice. Each whispered confession and tentative hope collectively nurtured a new understanding that the covenant with the divine is not a decree of perfection, but an invitation to grow together, imperfect yet ever aspiring toward love. Every passing day, I witnessed small miracles that affirmed this new covenant. A gentle smile exchanged between strangers along the winding paths outside the church, a shared tear during a moment of communal prayer, the silent affirmation in a nod of understanding. All of these were tokens of a renewed spiritual bond. The realization dawned upon me that sacredness lies as much in the ordinary moments as it does in grand epiphanies. The divine, in its infinite subtlety, speaks through the everyday acts of kindness, the courage to forgive, and the willingness to walk hand in hand through the valleys of our shared doubts. I dedicated myself to nurturing this transformational path by integrating these lessons into every facet of my ministry. I re-envisioned sermons not as proclamations of dogma, but as invitations for each soul to explore the vast, interwoven realms of doubt and devotion. I spoke of the luminous moments I had witnessed, the radiant light that had once illuminated my path during my near-death collapse, and of the touch of darkness that had taught me the value of introspection. I reminded my congregation that every shadow in our lives need not be met with fear, for it is in those very shadows that the true contours of our inner light are revealed. In this way, the new covenant became a living promise, a commitment to transform not only the way we worship, but also how we live in the world. It calls us to see every heart as a sacred vessel, every falter as an opportunity for renewal, and every moment of questioning as a doorway to greater wisdom. I have come to believe that the divine is not a distant, abstract command, but an intimate, evolving presence that meets us exactly where we are, at once fragile and fiercely alive. Standing at this new juncture, I feel a powerful call toward unity, a call to build bridges over the chasms of doubt, to heal the wounds inflicted by fear, and to celebrate the interdependence of light and dark within us all. The new covenant is not merely a personal revelation, it is a communal pledge to allow our shared imperfections to become a testament to our enduring capacity for love, transformation, and hope. With this renewed spirit, I step forward, inviting all who seek guidance to join in the sacred journey of becoming whole, a journey marked by compassion, inquiry, and the persistent, radiant glow of the divine.